Welcome. Welcome to our monthly webinar series where we start to take a look at organizational situations and challenges and try and provide some insight, some strategy, some tips around how to address them. This month, we're going to be taking a look at the different ways in which people work. Now, you don't necessarily need me to tell you that different people tend to approach the work a little bit differently. If you've been working in the workplace for 24 hours, you probably have noticed that different people might approach the work different ways. The challenge then becomes is that these different approaches can create quite a bit of conflict or frustration and end up impacting efficiency, productivity, overall organizational health. And so one of the things that we also want to take a look at are what we will refer to as rules of engagement. These would be ways in which we can start to address some of these situations. My name is Joe Jotkowitz, and I am with the Executive Advisory. I'm a consultant in the firm, and we do a lot of training and development, one-on-one coaching, assessment, organizational development, and a lot of that does end up falling into what we refer to as the people side of business. As a matter of fact, it is this people piece that we will take a look at, especially as we start to talk a little bit about different ways of working. Have you noticed that sometimes people don't always necessarily read through the entire email that you sent? Or others maybe prefer to sleep on decisions as opposed to make a call right then and there in the moment. None of this is right or wrong, but rather understanding perhaps why we do some of that voodoo that we do can really help us address this concept of just different approaches. Now, I will admit I am probably a little biased in this one because these different ways of working is probably the reason why I originally got into this field. I remember early in my career, I ended up reading an article about an organization that was trying to create the master global computer, if you will. The premise was if we could get people from all over the world working on one computer, we could create a certain amount of consistency, a platform across the earth. And this organization ended up gathering people from all over the world. There was a team from Germany, there were folks from Japan, in the United States, and several other countries. And they started to assign different functions for building this to different groups. What really became evident very quickly, though, was that culture ended up influencing the way people worked on this project, the way they showed up, and that culture didn't necessarily always align. For example, there was a lot of engineering that was coming out of Germany, and it was very detail-oriented, very in the weeds, if you will. Well, when that got sent over to folks in the US to review, they tend to approach it from a little bit more of a high-level perspective. And as a result, there was some frustration going on between getting into the depth versus staying big picture. In addition, there was a lot of coding that was being sent over to Japan. But due to areas of hierarchy, if there were issues from the US to coders in Japan, folks in Japan didn't necessarily disagree or push back. Due to culture and hierarchy, that wasn't necessarily the expectation or the norm. And so unfortunately, folks in the US were getting frustrated because these concerns weren't being raised. Once again, not right or wrong, but just different ways of working. This shows up in a lot of different places. This can be perhaps because of the function, the job in which we do. Some of us might be a little bit more technical, perhaps in science type roles or functions. Maybe we tend to be a little bit more research oriented, whereas others might be a little bit more creative in our roles. Maybe we approach it from more of a marketing or a bigger picture perspective. And as a result, it can create some challenge when we've got to work on the same project. Sometimes even just where we are placed. Some of us might be working a little bit more virtual or remote. Others may be a little bit more hybrid. And then yet some perhaps in the office. All of these different dynamics can really play into the way different people show up and the way that we get the job done. Another example of this, or a lens to look through, is through psychometric tools or assessments that turn around and start to evaluate maybe how I show up. And there's a lot of these different types of tools out there. As you see here, a DISC, for example, is a very common one that we see in the workplace. Different people show up with different behavioral, different communication styles. HBDI, or the 4 different thinking hats, is another way to start to take a look at it. Interaction styles, TKI, the Thomas Kilmann Index, starts to take a look at the way we might approach conflict a little bit differently. All of these tools just help us understand how different people might have different styles or different approaches to the same type of work. And we are well versed in just about all of these if there was ever an interest to be able to facilitate either a session or a program using any of these. But the idea behind this is that there is a lens that can be used, which then provides people a common language in order to start to address this. Why? Why is it so important to start to take a look at this and address it? Well, because it really does speak to the importance of organizational dynamics and team effectiveness. When you start to take a look at the way a team operates, Bruce Tuckman has done quite a bit of research around the development of a team, and he has started to call out, usually teams when they first come together go through this stage called forming, or getting to know each other. Introductory period. We start to learn a little bit more about different roles, responsibilities, and what it is that we are trying to do. But then that is followed up by storming. This is that stage where suddenly disagreement might occur. Miscommunication, maybe even misalignment. But hopefully we give each other benefit of the doubt. We understand that we just have slightly different approaches perhaps. And as a result, we can start to talk through what we will call norms, or those rules of engagement. This is really more about how we are going to work together. And we want to gain commitments and agreements with one another. When we are able to do that, that's then when teams are able to perform at a high level. And then, as Tuckman had called out, in teams and team interaction, it's not uncommon. There's transforming or reforming going on as different goals come through the team, different people translate through the team. But this is the place, this is the space that we are going to play in today. Taking a look at maybe some of those items that can create some frustration, some angst, and how can we start to rethink that in order to develop norms or rules of engagement. What we have learned is you don't just put a group of people together and poof, we suddenly become a team, so to speak. So here are some of those areas, some of those concepts that we will take a look at when it comes to understanding different ways of working. First, maybe it's through the lens of our role or our function that might create slightly different approaches. Another one, and this is one that I will share a very personal example around, the concept of ASAP. As a matter of fact, I wrote a short article this past month around ASAP and how frustrating these 4 letters, this one acronym, can be sometimes. We'll take a look at the way that people assert themselves and maybe how some of those differences in terms of ways of working might manifest. We're also going to focus on a very common tool that we use every single day, email. How does email start to end up translating into slightly different ways in which we approach the work? And then lastly, decision making. This is a big area where we start to see a lot of challenge, sometimes frustration around the way that people show up and try and get the job done. So let's go ahead and get into it. And we'll begin first by taking a look at our role, our function in the organization, and ideally a lens with which to use in order to understand perhaps how different people might end up approaching the same work. So in viewing this through the lens of what I refer to as our role, our function, what we have learned is sometimes some of us end up operating in what I refer to as more of a creative type role. If I'm in a creative role, maybe it's more around marketing, strategic planning. Usually in this type of a role, I'm trying to create, I'm trying to expand, I'm trying to grow. As a matter of fact, I'm probably trying to look at all the possibilities. Whereas others of us in the organization might have a role that can be defined a little bit more as control. Here, I'm usually trying to manage, budget, plan, allocate. These types of functions might be a little bit more in accounting or finance, maybe even in legal or compliance. So here's what we've learned. every organization has both of these functions. Every organization needs both of these functions. If you've got an organization, for example, that is purely creative, it can just spin out of control. And we don't necessarily get things done, or we don't get things done in a profitable or efficient manner. And if you've got an organization that is solely based on control, then we might end up falling behind the eight ball as other companies end up moving faster and ahead of us. So we need both functions in the company. Organizations have both functions. And it is the way in which these functions operate that can create a lot of that frustration and angst around the way that we work. For example, if I am in a sales role, maybe a little bit more creative, and I'm trying to come up with new approaches, new proposals, new products, new ways in which to engage my clients and be able to sell them on products, I'm probably going to push the limits a little bit. Well, when I finally get that result and I get that buy-in from my client, then I will turn over to perhaps my product folks in order to start to scope out what it is that we want to deliver to the client. Well, my product person might come back to me and say, wait a second, I don't know if we can do all of that, especially within the time frame in which you are saying that we're going to be able to deliver. We need both of these functions. But as you can see, this can start to create a little bit of that challenge. So how do we solve for this? The key is communication. The key is negotiation. The key is compromise in order to find that common ground. That we come to the table, we give one another benefit of the doubt that both of us really are trying to serve the customer, serve the client well, and start to take a look at what we can do together. Another lens with which to take a look at this is through one that I had said earlier, I personally identify with and ended up writing an article, a cup of joe, if you will, about this earlier this month. These 4 letters, ASAP. These 4 letters can create so much challenge that we don't necessarily always realize it. As a matter of fact, I had this occur to me very, very early in my career. I was tapped to put together a presentation deck for a senior level audience. I was extremely excited. I felt honored to be able to do this. My manager asked me if I would put this together because he said I've got a little bit of flair with PowerPoint. So I said, great. And we started to talk a little bit about what the scope was and what he wanted. And then at the end of the conversation, I asked him, when do you need this by? And his response, oh, no hurry, ASAP. I said, great. I'm thinking to myself, I've got plenty of time on this. As a matter of fact, I had a few other projects that I just wanted to kind of get off my plate so I could dedicate the time and the effort to this one solely. Well, a couple of days later, my manager ends up coming by my desk. He says, hey, Joe, I just wanted to check in. How's that going? I said, oh, it's going well. I've already started to think through what I want to do, and I've started to sketch out some ideas. I said, I've got a couple of other things that I'm actually trying to get off my plate right now so I can dedicate the time and the effort and the focus to this, if that's okay. He said, yeah, absolutely. I said, well, when do you need this by? He said, oh, whenever you can. ASAP would be great. So once again, I was reconfirmed. All right, great. I've got plenty of time on this. I'm looking forward to it. Well, the following week, I had finally been able to get a couple of those projects off my plate so I could dedicate the time. And at that point, my manager came by one more time and asked me, how's it going and where it's at? But this time, I noticed his tone was a little different. I could tell there was a little bit of tension in his face. He seemed a little concerned. But I responded in a very enthusiastic manner. Oh, it's going well. As a matter of fact, I've already started to put together an agenda. I'm looking forward to really getting into this. At which point then he responded, so when do you think you're going to be able to get this to me? And I said, well, I'm hoping to have a rough draft by next week for you to look at. At which point, all of a sudden, I could see the alarm, the alert on his face. He said, I was really hoping to be able to show some of this tomorrow in a meeting with senior leadership. And immediately, my heart sank. The last thing I wanted to do was disappoint my manager after he gave me this phenomenal opportunity. I said, I'll tell you what, I will work through the day on this. As a matter of fact, I will get you something, I promise, by tonight so that you can review it tomorrow. He did not intend to create that last minute situation. I did not intend to create any sort of stress or tension in him as I took my time in delivering this. But unfortunately, you can see how this very simple misinterpretation, the way that we define this and work, can create some stress and some angst. We do a lot of workshops, trainings around different style, very much based on some of the psychometric tools that I shared earlier. And this is one of those concepts we always tease out in those workshops. And what we have uncovered over the years is people define ASAP on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, ASAP might be interpreted as yesterday. In other words, it should already be done and it's got to move to the top of your priority list right now. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, ASAP can also be defined as when I'm able to put it on my schedule. And so one of the recommendations that we typically make in these types of communication programs is let's get rid of this acronym ASAP. It's vague and unfortunately just gets interpreted a lot of different ways. Let's start replacing it with dates and times or even benchmarks along the way. The whole idea is just to create more clarity. Another one of these lenses with which to look at the way in which we get things done is through the way that we assert ourselves. Now, you don't need me to tell you that some of us tend to be a little bit more introverted in our approach, whereas others might be a little bit more extroverted. If, for example, I'm a little bit more introverted, maybe I don't always speak up as often. For whatever reason, maybe I don't feel as if I've thought through the topic enough, or maybe there are other people already sharing what I would share and I don't want to repeat or waste people's time. Whereas others might show up a little bit more extroverted. And as a result, they might participate a little bit more often, might even share more information, don't necessarily need a reason to speak, just an audience. And an audience of one sometimes is perfectly okay. In addition, sometimes we see this show up in the way in which people make decisions. If I'm a little bit more extroverted, I might make decisions a little bit quicker. If people are familiar with that 80-20 rule, if you've got 80% of the information, then the idea is you should make the decision. If you wait for that 20%, the opportunity can pass you by. If I'm a little bit more on the extroverted side, I actually might be a little bit more comfortable with even a 70-30 approach. Or if I'm a little bit more extreme on this end of the spectrum, maybe even a 60-40 type of an approach. My perspective is if we go in the wrong direction, it's not a mistake. It's rather now we know what to do differently next time. Whereas if I'm a little bit more introverted in my decision making, I really like to process information. I really like to think it through. I really like to make sure that I cross all my T's, dot all my I's, or even socialize the idea a little bit more. And so that 80-20, maybe, candidly, I'm a little bit more of a 90-10 type person where I can work with 10% ambiguity. Or if I'm a really high introvert on this, maybe I'm a 95-5, where 5% unknown or ambiguity is my comfort level. So we aren't trying to create frustration or angst when we're making these decisions. We are just trying to do it from a place of where we are comfortable. But you can see how this can start to create some conflict or tension when people are working together. Another way to illustrate this is through the lens of email, something that we use all the time. And this is a way that I tend to describe this in terms of either skimmers or skeptics. If I am a skimmer and I am reviewing email, I might just kind of take a look at the highlights. As a matter of fact, maybe what really grabs my attention are bullet points, or maybe even things that are highlighted in there. And if I'm a little bit more of a skimmer, one of the things you might know, I'm not also a big scroller down to the bottom in order to understand what it is you want me to do with this email. Whereas if I'm a little bit more of a skeptic, I'm probably going to look through that email and every detail that was shared. I might even read that email twice because I just want to make sure I understand it. Now, once again, not right or wrong. We both might get the information. But then what gets interesting is the way we start to process that can create a difference in the way that we work. If, for example, I am a skeptic and I am structuring an email, odds are I'm going to make sure all the information is in there. In addition, if I've got some supporting material, it's probably going to be there as an attachment. Whereas if I'm a little bit more of a skimmer, I don't know if I'm necessarily going to read through all of that. As a matter of fact, if I structure that email as a skeptic and I share all the information, then as a skimmer, I go ahead and I start to read it. And I've got a question before I'm even done with the first paragraph. Odds are my response is going to be to pick up the phone and call to ask a question. Seems reasonable.
But if I'm a skeptic, that might start to feel a little frustrating. Why? Because the answer is in the email if you had taken the time to read it all the way through. That's the reason why I put the email together. And you can see where sometimes then it's almost like two ships passing in the night. And we just get a little bit of misalignment, miscommunication, misunderstanding. Not my intention, but perhaps the way that we work and show up can create some of that. Taking a look at one more lens in order to focus on the way that we work is through decision-making and the decision-making process. This is one that I see quite often when working with executives. When it comes to the decision-making process, what we've learned is generally we show up with one of two responsibilities, that of either a subject matter expert or that of a policymaker. If I show up and my role is that of a subject matter expert, then generally my responsibility, my job, is to know what I do at the subatomic level. I've got to be able to understand all the details and their implications. I've got to be able to take a seat at the table and say, here's what I think, and here are the reasons why. And I've got to be able to advocate my point of view. At that point, though, after I do that, then I've got to be able to do this. Why? Because that's when the policymaker takes over. And the role of the policymaker in these situations is to listen to as many different subject matter experts around the table. Ask questions in order to truly understand the information and where they're coming from. Also, take a look at out over the horizon and anticipate where we're trying to go and what the best decision is, or set policy. Now, when I talk through this dynamic, most people take a step back and go, well, that makes sense. As a matter of fact, I can even see where I am expected to be a subject matter expert or a policymaker, or possibly even just a touch of both at times. So where does this start to create some conflict in the ways that we work? Well, if I am a subject matter expert and I believe I am the one that should be setting policy, that can start to come across as entitlement. Or if, hypothetically, I am a subject matter expert and I start to operate, behave a little bit more as a subject matter, if I am a policymaker and I start to operate more as a subject matter expert, it can feel like I'm getting too much into the weeds. And as a result, I start to come across a little micromanaging. So once again, not my intention, but you can see the way that we work in this regard can start to create some conflict, some misunderstanding, and some frustration. So as we start to think about the way that we show up in order to do the job, it's not right or wrong. It's not good or bad. It's how do we find that common ground, that common understanding in order to operate as effectively as possible. And that's what we're really trying to do here. As a matter of fact, if there is anything that we can do in order to help understand this a little bit more, we do thought partnership around the different ways in which people show up and work, and perhaps how to understand that, how to help teams and people align more effectively. There are various tools and assessments out there that can start to evaluate and take a look at the way different people show up, where that works for the team, and perhaps even where people might want to adjust. We can also take a look at training and development programs or executive coaching sometimes in order to address this topic. But there's a lot of different ways in which we might be able to help out. In addition, I will also invite you to our next webinar when me and my colleague, Jerry Brem, start to take a look at modern day professionalism. It is a lot less around attire and deference and really more about understanding our role and how we might show up. Feel free to go ahead and click on that QR code and register for our next webinar on November 18th at 11 a.m. Pacific. And if there is anything that we can do, please don't hesitate. Feel free to reach out and contact us through our socials. Thanks. Appreciate you attending and hope to see you again.